So I'll be presenting the work I did with Jed Story and Jeff Clune on encouraging creative thinking in robots. So a traditional evolutionary algorithm rewards for better performance on a task or getting closer to the goal, but it doesn't take into consideration the path necessary to get there. So for example, in this maze, the robot is trying to navigate its way from start to finish, and the fitness measure is how close it gets to the goal. So evolution will produce a lot of individuals that get stuck in what we call local optima. So these are areas of high fitness that don't lead to the goal. And this is because of deception in the problem. So local fitness gradients do not point in the direction of the absolute goal. And we want to avoid this, so recent innovations have shown that encouraging behavior diversity in evolution will help solve the problem. So two variants of this are novelty search, which just rewards for behavioral diversity, and multi-objective algorithms, so for example, performance and behavioral diversity. So in the same example, if you encourage behavioral diversity, robots will tend to explore out in the search space and eventually produce something that solves the problem. So encouraging behavioral diversity will avoid deception. But to encourage behavioral diversity, you need a behavioral distance metric. And this can be something really specific, such as the robot's final location, or how many corridors it travels through, how many times it bumps into a wall, how many times it uses a certain leg or something in robot locomotion. But it can also be something very general. So Murray and Dongsu in 2012 introduced a measure that relies on the inputs and outputs of a neural network. So in this metric, the inputs and outputs of the neural network are stored in a vector over time steps, and these are concatenated, and Hamming distance is used to compare individuals to see how different they are. So although this technique helps avoid deception, we have a problem that we call novelty plateaus, and these are regions where it's difficult to produce new behavior. So a single mutation may not produce a new behavior, and it may take a certain sequence of mutations for new behavior to arise. So for example, this robot is currently bumping into a wall, and we want to change that behavior. However, a sequence of mutations is required. So the mutations necessary will start to pop up, but they're not rewarded because they don't directly produce new behaviors. And so it's not until, for example, the fifth mutation here that the robot does something different, avoids the wall. And it's really difficult to produce this specific sequence of mutations because you don't reward for the intermediate mutations to get there. And that's equivalently not rewarding for the stepping stones. And we want to do that and encourage new behaviors. So we think about how humans get unstuck on a problem. For example, if you're thinking about a math problem and you have a certain strategy you think will solve it, however, you keep thinking in that direction and you don't solve the problem, you try doing different things, but you're just stuck in a mental rut. So what you would do is think creatively about the problem. So if you can think of a different strategy to solve the problem, or think outside the box, eventually you will solve the problem. So for example, in these pictures you should see an animal. So what do you guys see in these for? Yeah, so if you change your representation of these images though, then you'll begin to see something different. So on the top, if you tilt your head or something, you flip the image representation in your head, then you actually see different animals. Do you see those? Yeah, so that looked like a deer or lamb, and now it's a seal, and similarly. And with the other image, it's something similar. So you could imagine a duck facing that way or a rabbit facing that way. So it just depends on how you look at it, how you interpret it. Here's another example where a duck is trying to get a peanut out of a glass bottle that's filled partially with water. This experiment was actually done on crows, I believe. And so the duck will try the obvious approach, trying to fish it out with a stick. I'm sure humans would do something similar at first. And you can do slightly different things, but there's not anything really new unless you think creatively. So if the duck here comes up with a whole new approach by thinking of something different, it may occur to her to instead drop pebbles in the glass bottle. And so a different way of approaching this problem leads to a completely new behavior, and this eventually allows the duck to solve the problem and get the peanut. So we want to encourage the same kind of creative thinking in robots. We introduced a new technique to encourage creative thinking in robots that rewards for novel thinking. So we are rewarding for novel firing patterns in the hidden neurons. And this is basically encouraging new cognition. And we call this the creative thinking approach. So to compare against the previous metric, we now also store the hidden neurons, the firing patterns of the hidden neurons in the vector. And so when we take the difference of these vectors then and encourage that to be a large value, then we're encouraging the hidden neurons to be different from previous individuals in addition to the inputs and outputs. So that's encouraging novel thinking in addition to novel behavior. So in our experiments, we use a multi-objective algorithm where diversity and performance are the two objectives. We use fixed topology and an element network, which is just a simple recurrent network. We use a direct encoding, population size of 200 individuals, and 50 runs of each treatment in each experiment. So this is the first experiment we did, and it's a deceptive maze similar to the example I showed earlier. Although there's deception, both of the treatments have a diversity objective, so it's actually a relatively easy problem for evolution to solve in this case. So in the results you see that both treatments actually solve it within 1,500 generations, and that's not a whole lot. So this is a relatively easy problem, and you see that actually behavioral diversity, which is in green, seems to beat creative thinking approach by a bit, although the differences are not significant. But we think that creative thinking approach isn't very beneficial in this case because the problem's too easy. It's easy to generate novel behaviors in this case, and so the approach that focuses on that will be more efficient. So we want to test this on a harder problem where it would be beneficial to have novel thoughts. So we chose the ball collection experiment. It's been used in previous papers, and the robot has to pick up each of the balls individually, drop it in the illuminated area for fitness. This is a video from one of my runs. This is a difficult problem because the robot's not told ahead of time what the environment looks like, and it doesn't gain fitness for just picking up a ball or dropping it anywhere. It has to pick it up, navigate to the correct area, drop it, before it gains any fitness. So we really want to reward the stepping stones along the way. So here are the results for the ball collection experiment. You see that creative thinking approach does beat behavioral diversity only in this case, but it's significant at only a few points. However, you can start to see that when behavioral diversity only seems to get stuck on a performance plateau, creative thinking approach escapes that much more quickly. But we wanted to test this on an even harder problem to see if it would make a bigger impact. And in this problem, we just changed the ball collection experiment a little, where the robot has to collect the balls in a certain sequence, and that increases the difficulty. So if the robot collects the second ball first, it won't gain any fitness. And here are the results for that experiment. You see that, again, creative thinking approach beats behavioral diversity only, and this time it's significant for around 15,000 generations, from around 38,000 to 53,000 generations. And again, you see that when behavioral diversity only gets stuck, creative thinking approach escapes it more quickly. The final experiment we did was another hard version of the ball collection experiment. So in this problem, the balls are located in the corner, and that makes it a lot harder for the robot to run into the balls by chance. Originally, they were placed sort of around the robot, and the robot could sense them and would accidentally run into them. But here, that's much less likely, so it's more difficult. And also, we've also just located further from the goal, and the robot has to collect them in the same number of time steps, so that also increases difficulty. And so here are the results for this problem. You can see that creative thinking approach significantly outperforms behavioral diversity only at nearly every generation. And again, you see that it quickly escapes fitness plateaus. So now we look at computational cost. We did not actually compare the running times, but there was no noticeable slowdown. And the simulation time dwarfs diversity calculation by a lot, even with the added hidden neurons. So it wasn't a huge computational cost. And hammering distance is optimized with binary vectors, so the comparison is fairly fast. In the future, we'd like to test this approach on a problem requiring memory, because rewarding for different thought patterns may encourage the robot to remember different things. That would be really helpful in a memory requiring problem. And we'd also like to dynamically adjust the relative emphasis on behavioral diversity and thought diversity. As you saw in the easier problems, there wasn't much of a difference, and thought diversity might actually slow it down. And in earlier generations of hard problems, that was a similar case. So at the beginning, it's easy to generate novel behaviors. And so we would like to emphasize thought diversity more when it hits some kind of plateau. We'd also like to scale to larger networks, and in that case, computational costs would become somewhat an issue. So we would take either a random sample, or we would emphasize the higher level neurons, so abstractions of thought. We'd also like to make this method work with evolving topology, for example, using neat historical markings. It's not directly related to the approach, but currently we're comparing vectors of the same length, so we'd like to also make it work with evolving topology. And we'd like to apply it to even more difficult problems. To summarize, we introduced the concept of a novelty plateau and introduced the creative thinking approach as a way to overcome it. The experiments showed that the performance improves by using creative thinking approach, especially as problem difficulty increases. So that's very promising. And we think that it'll help expand the scope of problems solvable by evolutionary algorithms. Thank you.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions. Could you just briefly explain how you measure the
Yeah, so our measure of creative thinking is basically we store the firing patterns of the hidden neurons in addition to the input and output neurons, and we try to maximize the difference between those vectors. So we have a vector that stores inputs, outputs, and the firing patterns of hidden neurons. So when we want to increase the difference, then we're increasing how different the thought patterns are and encouraging creative thinking. Yeah.
So, related. So the firing is either on or off, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that simplifies the novelty state that you need to tune. But as you increase the difficulty of the task, possibly increase the number of neurons you have, all you end up with, I'm guessing, dozens of behaviors, but you will still have novel firing patterns. So would you expect in the scaling up of the network and the increasing the difficulty that the creative thinking approach would still hold?
Most likely. So we know that we will produce some thought patterns that are not very useful, but we do want to keep those because they probably have different evolvabilities, and later on they'll lead to possibly good solutions. And on a more difficult problem, we could just take a random sampling if computational cost becomes a problem for sampling.
That's a really nice idea. And you mentioned briefly at the end about larger networks, perhaps with involving topology, which could lead to a larger and larger network. Do you have any thoughts on how the sampling might best be done when you have a growing number of neurons and you're comparing the thoughts? Somebody fewer nouns than somebody else or something like that to each other?
So for that, I was thinking probably using the historical markings to see how different they are.
Would you use all of them? Or do you think you choose a subset?
Yeah, a subset. So either random sampling or try to focus on the higher level neurons, abstractions, and so if there's multiple hidden layers, probably take the top layer.
Just a clarification question. So you're collecting the input and output from each of from the neuron or artificial neural networks. Is that happening at each time step in the simulation then?
Yeah.
Discrete time simulation going on, and how many steps along each that simulation are doing the ball collection?
So the ball collection experiment actually had 3 sub-trials in each trial where the robot would start at different locations. And in each of those sub-trials, there's 3,000 time steps. And yeah, so we are storing the inputs, outputs, and hidden neurons for each time step and concatenating those and comparing those vectors.
Did you think about weighting the hidden neuron activation different than the input and output activation when you calculate the metric?
Yeah, actually, so that was on this slide. So we'd want to eventually try to adjust that to place emphasis on certain parts, depending on whether it's plateauing and things like that.
Okay.
So in this, you have your gigantic vector that you collected of everything, and then you are comparing that for one individual to what? To every other individual who's calculating any of these, or?
To the ones in the archive, so I think the somewhat good performing ones.
To some extent, in the future, maybe a couple of years from now, the brains, there will be hardware, and then it will be almost standalone research because all the thinking will be physical processes, and you can say the thinking is behavior. So like, first you have the behavioral parameters, in addition the thinking, and in the end it's all the same, you could say. But of course, that was now is not. So we still have a distinction between what computers do and what the physical world. Just a comment. More questions? There's one in the picture.
I was thinking, as the networks become potentially more complex, would you have to change the rules for how you would determine levels between the neurons? So I know that you proposed a couple of different methods for being able to deal with data mining. So the thought is, could it come to more than what it's suggested, where you're essentially arbitrarily choosing rules in order to try to allow novel finite rates to push the behavior forward? Does that make sense?
I think so. So, yeah, I guess we want to find a method to select the higher level thought patterns. So if there's some method specifically to do that, that would be good.
Yeah, that was a really good talk. Thank you. When you're looking at scaling up, it seems to be one of the big concerns. It strikes me that you're looking at a relatively small number of neurons right now with a very large number of time steps. And that maybe if we could focus the sampling on certain parts, focus sampling across time, and look at, like we saw in some of the earlier talks, there were very specific parts in names, for example, where a lot of effort went into really much stronger. If we could focus the sampling on those parts of the time, that would be a really efficient way of sampling any really relevant information.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good idea.
One more question? Who?
Yeah, and I'm just going to comment that behavioral diversity metrics, I think they're fairly robust to like the importance of data. You just want to tease out differences between the networks or the organisms. Because I had something similar a while back where I just had a random syllabus of like I completely randomly generated inputs and the outputs that resulted from them, and that was enough to measure differences in behavior. But you could also, instead of having randomly generated inputs, you could sample at necessarily have to be so strict. You might get better performance in some situations, but I think that as long as you're evaluating the behavior of the network in some way, it's probably going to work.
I just had one other thought that occurred to me. In these cases where like behavior is pretty much the same but thinking is different, probably in this scenario, a lot of the time somebody crashed or something like that. So at that point, the only divergence you can get is by their thought. But I just thought it would be interesting to see, basically, if those thoughts would have triggered other behaviors had they not crashed. It'd be interesting to see what would happen if their personalities differ, kind of measure them out or something, to see what they would have done, what it means to be a creative thinker in the behavior space.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
All right, let's thank the speaker again.